Welcome to the Marker Tech Conference. I'd like to introduce today Jared Spataro, a Corporate Vice President at Microsoft 365. In his current role at Microsoft, Jared is responsible for Microsoft 365s, including business management, product and partner marketing. He joined Microsoft in 2006. And prior to that, worked in a number of small and mid-sized technology companies. Welcome. How are you?
Thank you, Daphne. It's really good to be here, and I'm doing very well. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Where are you talking from?
I live just outside Seattle in a little place called Issaquah. So it's about kind of 20, 30 minutes outside Seattle towards the east.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'd like to start by asking about, we live in a very strange era, but one of I think the upsides of this health and economic crisis is the quick adaptation of new technologies. Can you tell us what surprised you, what did exceedingly well, and where did you find the biggest challenges?
Sure. Yeah, I think it has been a really interesting 4 or 5 months for us here at Microsoft. If I think about the things that surprised me, I think I was most surprised by the rapid transformation. We've been talking about digital transformation at Microsoft for a long time and how we needed to increasingly invest in digital technologies. And all of a sudden, overnight, we invested, and many companies and organizations kind of moved overnight to remote work. And that was just not something I expected. I was very surprised by that. There have been some wonderful things that have happened because of that. We've actually seen productivity continue largely unabated or unaffected. Productivity's been pretty good as we measure productivity across, for instance, software developers within our own company, as we look broadly across information worker type productivity. So that has been good news for us. I think it's been good news to see that the tools have largely worked as we had hoped. You know, these types of tools allow us to video conference and to chat and share files and work on content together. And that's been good. I think that there has been some bad news, though. From our research, we definitely have seen that people are struggling. They're increasingly feeling isolated. In fact, from a recent poll that we did around the world, we found that 60% of workers felt that they were more isolated from their colleagues than they had been previous to the pandemic. There was definitely a feeling of meeting fatigue, that day after day it's the same thing and we stare at a screen. There's also this lack of boundaries between work and life. It's been difficult for people to navigate that well. And there hasn't been a lot of time for recovery and personal well-being. One really interesting stat that caught my attention was that weekend work is spiking. On Teams, which is the technology we're using right now, we've seen that Teams chats have increased over 200% on Saturday and Sunday. So it's, we are definitely seeing in the data that things are changing, that the old way of working, literally overnight for many people changed, and that the world wasn't quite ready for where we were going. So we're all trying to find the new norm now.
So you're in charge of Microsoft Teams, which is a very big thing now for everyone, basically, together with some of its competitors. I understand that you have a together mode that you wanted to tell us about, because it has maybe a way to address some of the things that you mentioned now, some of the challenges of feeling isolated, of staring at the screen and being confused, who is talking now, looking at all these little squares on the screen.
Well, Together Mode is really interesting for me because it's really the first major feature that we thought of, that we worked on, and that we have released just all as a result of the pandemic. Most of the things that have happened have been kind of in process prior to this, so we've been working on them, we accelerated them. One of the things that really caught our attention very early on was this idea of meeting fatigue. We actually went in and did some brain research where we hooked people up, to these brain scans so that we could watch them communicate and collaborate in real life, with people who they were next to, and then do that same type of communication and collaboration remotely using a video conferencing tool. And we found that the brain had to work a lot harder as they were trying to do this through video conferencing, and we wondered why that was. One of the hypotheses that we had was that as we were looking across these little squares, that we're all in, that the brain was actually having a really hard time parsing through what it was seeing, because you would see each person with a different background. It was difficult to concentrate. You didn't know who was speaking. And so we did a little bit of an experiment, taking some of the experience that we have here in the company from virtual reality, and thought to ourselves, what would happen if we could put people into the same background? Like, we know that when we put people into a virtual world, it gets their brains into a place where they start to think differently about what they're experiencing. And we used AI technology to cut people out from their backgrounds and put them onto the same background. And then, to be honest with you, I was totally surprised by the results. What we found was that the brain did have to work less hard, that what the brain was able to do then was just focus on the people. And the brain is very good at picking up cues and clues from people, those kind of nonverbal kind of hints that we get. And so it decreased the load on the brain, and it also created kind of a more central feeling of natural interaction that we didn't previously have. So we're very excited about it. We think it's just the beginning of the types of things that we can do. I was really inspired by this idea that it was, brought on by the pandemic, but also augmented by what we had learned previous to the pandemic in fields like virtual reality. So it's been a really interesting discovery. I think it's just the beginning of our journey together as we learn more.
Some of the features of remote work tools are rather sophisticated, like the one you just mentioned. So I was asking myself, how do you teach people, users, to adapt and incorporate all of these? Most people tend to use, when they use Word or Office, they use just the basic functions, and with such sophisticated tools, maybe they just press, they press the link and they talk, and maybe they mute, maybe they record the talk, but how do you open all the possibilities?
It's an excellent question, and the short answer is you don't. What we've found is that the old model of technology, and Word is a great example, I think, it had literally thousands of features, and people would buy books and go to classes to learn how to use it. That old model was based on the kind of the underlying concept that you had to learn the technology, that you had to figure it out, that you had to understand and be able to delve into the menus and the features and options. The new model of technology, we believe really strongly, is that the technology will respond to you. And if I get even more pragmatic for a moment, we think that good apps going forward essentially are going to have a conversation with you. They are going to ask you questions. They are going to observe, what you're doing. In so many ways, our little Clippy decades ago was headed in the right direction. It was the right idea, probably the wrong time, and just not the right technology. But one simple example that I have is we have something in PowerPoint these days called Designer. It's a cloud-based design service. And as you put pictures onto a PowerPoint slide, it actually will pop up and say, hey, I've got some ways to lay that out based on what professional designers have done in the past. Do you like any of these? It is amazing. Actually, when you see the work that it does, it is stunning. I use it all the time. And in fact, we have over 1 billion slides that have been presented to users and kept by them all across the planet. So it's really getting a lot of use. And as you talk about these sophisticated features, we just believe that in the future, we're going to need to have the technology speak to you. One great example we introduced last week is something called Dynamic View. And Dynamic View actually changes the view in a video conference based on who's speaking the most, what content is being shared. It kind of moves things around and says, oh, these people have video on, these people are dialed in, here's the content that's being shared. It moves you kind of based on AI to try to get a configuration that's more productive for you. So just simple examples, but that idea of conversation we think is really important.
Where do you see the most potential? We have the use of these tools in education. My son spent 2 months at home learning through using Zoom classes, but I had the feeling that it wasn't utilized to its potential. We have work. We have, conferences such as these. We have marketing, maybe endeavors that can use these tools to reach people, to educate salespeople, and so on. So, where do you see the biggest potential or the most important thing for teams in the future?
Well, let me start by kind of going back to your original question. What surprised me? One of the things that surprised me the most was that the technology had matured to do a lot of things, but the cultural norms and the way the culture operated had not. That's a really interesting thought, because the reason we could immediately move to remote work and remote learning was, wow, the tech was there. It existed. It worked quite well. It scaled. We didn't have any services, whether it was Microsoft's or others, that just kind of failed and didn't work. So that's pretty amazing. But the culture wasn't there yet. And that's also very amazing. I don't know why, even though we had video conferencing, I didn't video conference my parents in for their grandchildren's birthdays. I just didn't do that very often previously. It's a common thing for us to do now. I don't know why. I'm a church leader in my community. I don't know why we didn't use video conferencing in the community. We just didn't. We kind of felt like, the way to do community church work is to go visit someone. And of course, that's really important. But boy, does it help to have the access to this technology. So if I take a step back and think about that framing, I would say that in each of the areas of life, and we kind of think of it as work, life, and learning, I think that there's tremendous possibilities with today's technology, but by changing the culture, thinking about what we do differently. That would range, broadly across. I think we're finding as we all start to go back to work now, I don't think we'll ever go back to the same configuration we had. Many countries will head back to a place where there will be more remote work going forward than anyone ever would have dreamed of. As we think about education, I know that many universities, high schools, even primary schools are realizing that although there's a lot to learn in remote education, there's a lot more we can do, especially when it comes to interactions that give us access to experts, real people in their fields who can help. And then I don't want to forget what's happening in the community. I think if you look at churches, religious organizations, as you look at school boards, as you look at, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and soccer clubs, some of the most heartwarming things for me have been seeing people use these tools to, for instance, conduct, football or soccer clinics, where young people would have a coach coaching them as they learned to shoot and perfected their dribble. I mean, all those things are possibilities going forward. So I think that over the course of the next few years, we're going to see the culture, society catch up with what the technology can do. And that's to me, that's very, that gives me a lot of hope of what's possible for humanity.
I can actually add to that. I was speaking to an American professor on the West Coast yesterday, and he said that there is kind of a revival for synagogues and Jewish communities getting together using remote access. And he was very, very optimistic about that. Also, my son, during the lockdown here in Tel Aviv, for 2 months, trained daily with his jiu-jitsu master, and he would work out when he couldn't just get out of the house. So it was basically very very surprising how well people adapted to that. Having said that, how do you bridge the gap between populations that have access to technology and have the money, and to disenfranchised populations that don't have it and might be left behind?
Yeah, to answer this one, I would take a step back a little bit and share with you some things that have been on my mind now for the last couple of months. This definitely the pandemic has shined a light on the idea of the digital divide and on the impact of that digital divide. Just in the papers here in the United States this week, there have been some reports of boy, remote education was good unless you're poor and didn't have access. All of a sudden, it didn't mean anything to you. And so I think there's a lot of discussion on that. I also would kind of think about what's happening here in terms of, in so many ways, the contract between an individual and society and the organizations of people they interact with. And that can be their employer, a company as an example. It can be the government. It certainly can be these churches, synagogues, mosques that they affiliate with. And I think there is an opportunity here for us as a society to really push pause and rethink the contract between individuals and those organizations, and think about what digital technology can do so that both the organizations and the people are benefited. So I don't have an answer of this is exactly how to go and do it, but I do think that organizations of all types in society have a responsibility now to be thinking about, who has access and who doesn't. Right now, as we see the social unrest in the United States that has spilled over into other parts of the world, I think it again has put the spotlight on this idea that, gosh, there are long-standing inequalities across the earth in social institutions, and that the digital technology has followed the rivers that have been carved out by those inequalities. And we have an opportunity now, I think, to say, wait a second, time out. We don't want that to be the case. We want to have the future be defined not by inequality, but by our ability to truly, be equal in our opportunity to get access to these things. But I think it is not just one organization that can do that. I don't think that the government of the United States or the Israeli government is solely responsible. I think that it comes down really to communities, again, to the social organizations, to be very thoughtful about what they can do for equality. And in particular, because we're all pushing out technology to use, to be really thoughtful about what we can do to ensure that people have equal access to that technology. It's hard. We certainly see it in education circumstances as being most acute. If a school system is going to move, for instance, to some aspect of remote learning, which I think will happen in a large part of the United States this fall as people go back to school, one of the key questions I think that school system should be asking is, who doesn't have access simply to the internet? Who doesn't have access to these tools? And what as a community are we going to do about that? So I think that there are some real social issues that we have an opportunity to tackle. And they'll be delicate, but I, for one, am definitely behind this idea of really digging into equality.
I think that we've discovered during this crisis that, sometimes for lack of function, and sometimes just because of people have good intentions, that community has to step forward and fill some gaps that governments and authorities cannot fulfill. We have time for one last question, and I wanted to ask you if you could just fulfill one of your dreams. What would be your dream to develop, to present, to maybe a problem to solve with the technology that you're in charge of?
I feel like one of my big dreams with the technology that I'm in charge of is to tackle that idea of inequality. But I'll start here. I believe that human potential is unlimited. I really believe that that the beauty and the wonder of the world comes from human ingenuity, from surprising places, from people who are born and raised in places that that would surprise us, who bring intellect and talent and amazing ability and shape and reshape the way the world works. So one of my desires with the technology I'm in charge of is to give people access, not just to kind of the basic resources, but to allow them to plug into the things that will help them to train their mind and their talents. That's what excites me the most, because I believe that there are people in the faraway corners of the earth. You don't have to live in New York City or in Los Angeles or in Tel Aviv to be talented and to offer something to the world. And I hope that technology will allow us to give those people access, again, not just to the basic resources, but to the best that's out there from humanity, because I believe at the end of the day, we all stand on the shoulders of giants as we invent the future. I think the future will come from the faraway kind of corners of the earth. And I hope our technology can help empower people to be able to change the world for good.
Okay, that's some high expectations, but we all have the same hope, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your beautiful talk.
Oh, it's been wonderful to speak with you. Thanks for the opportunity.